guys, it's Miss Miller. Welcome back from Christmas break. I hope you enjoyed it. We will be discussing a new segment, 15th and 16th century painting in Northern Europe. We left off with the early Italian Renaissance, so we're jumping over from Italy. We were kind of hanging out over here. You know, Italy looks like a boot. And we're going to be looking at the early Renaissance and the development of the Northern Renaissance in places like Belgium, Holland, Flanders, which was really a lot different than the Italian Renaissance. And we will compare and contrast both of those when we're done discussing those two different styles. So the Northern Renaissance was not a rebirth in the Italian sense. Artists in the Netherlands, modern Belgium, and it was called Flanders back then, and Holland, lacked Roman ruins to rediscover. So they didn't really have that sort of classical influence from the Greco-Roman era that Italy did. And so their style developed much differently. They still broke away from the Gothic style that both Italy and Northern Europe were engaged in before the Renaissance. One of the differences that we'll see is that while Italians look to classical antiquity for inspirations, Northern Europeans look to nature, and so that's going to be something to think about when we compare and contrast these two different styles. Without classical sculpture to teach them ideal proportions, they painted reality exactly as it appeared, in a detailed, realistic style. Portraits were such faithful likenesses, and that's something that starts to develop. There's a huge middle class that starts to develop because a lot of these cities are banking cities, and we'll talk about that in terms of how it influenced the economy of art. So portraits were in demand. And also, there was also this new oil medium that was discovered. The precision that these Northern Renaissance painters were able to achieve in their paintings was because of this new medium. Remember, in Italy, they're using fresco and tempera paint, so that's something else that you want to think about in terms of contrasting and comparing these two different paint mediums. Oil painting was important. It took longer to dry than tempera, and so Northern Renaissance painters could blend the colors, and they really were able to achieve these subtle variations in light and shade that really heightened illusion in three-dimensional form, and we'll see that and talk a little bit more about oil painting. So again, just to remind you, the areas that we're going to be looking at are the Netherlands, Burgundy and Flanders, which are today Belgium and Holland. And also this style is referred to as Flemish art. In addition to looking towards nature, because Northern Renaissance painters didn't have Greek and Roman art to look at, this notion of idealization of the figure would not be prevalent in this part of the world, getting these sort of classical, anatomically correct proportions. So a lot of these artists were also inspired from a painting style that came out of something called a miniaturist tradition, and this is something that we see with illuminated manuscript painting. So that's really what influenced them and what they had to look at in terms of inspiration. What we're looking at here is an altarpiece, and we're looking at different types of altarpieces. We've seen these before, but altarpieces during this period become much smaller and much more portable. They're not these huge, grand, sort of permanent fixtures in churches. Because of this developing middle class that I mentioned earlier, there's a need for these sort of private commissions. And so altarpieces are not just for churches anymore. But this diagram just kind of shows you, this one over here is called a diptych, and these are vocabulary terms that you should know, is like 2 panels, a triptych is 3 panels, and then there's just different variations, and obviously some of these altarpieces can become very complex. All Alright, so this is our first altarpiece that we're going to be looking at. It was done by a painter, Robert Campin. It's called the Merode Altarpiece, and it was painted between 1425 and 28. Remember, these painters came out of a manuscript tradition of painting, and they did eventually move into panel painting. They used luxurious pigments, and they were the first artists to explore the medium of oil painting. And this allowed for them to explore very descriptive surface details, and allowed them to really create these very complex and sophisticated altarpieces. So take a minute and look at the painting. Think about maybe looking back at some of the earlier altarpieces and maybe early Italian paintings that we looked at, and see if you can see any differences in the style. While you're contemplating this piece, I'm going to give you some details. It is very small scale. It was only about 3 feet wide. So this was commissioned for a private home, not a church. Again, this is a sort of commission that signaled the rise of a middle class and this idea of the economy changing during the Renaissance. The central panel here, so this is a triptych, shows the Annunciation taking place. What's interesting about it is that it's taking place in a contemporary middle-class home for the period. That's something that we haven't seen before. Usually, a lot of these religious narratives would take place, in a sort of nondescript landscape, or, obviously with Byzantine, this sort of ethereal, sort of flat, universe. But here, it's very interesting because this is what a contemporary sort of middle-class home for this period would have looked like. So why do you think this is important, and why do you think the painter chose to put the Annunciation in this setting? That's something that you should think about. Well, one of the things that might have come to mind is that this obviously would have made the viewer who was looking at this piece feel more connected to the image and therefore more connected with God. So by including these sort of familiar details, it was this idea that the viewer would be more would feel more comfortable and be more intimately connected. So we're going to look at some details of the altarpiece. This depiction here, we see the Virgin. She's a virgin of humility. She is sitting on the ground reading her Bible. Notice the cloth that she uses to separate her hands from the Bible. She's reading a book of hours, and we've talked about this before. This was sort of a religious book that was often, these manuscripts were often created for the upper class and were very beautifully decorated and illuminated. The front cover would have been encrusted with beautiful precious metals and stones, and so that's one reason why they think she might be having the cloth to sort of protect the cover, but also maybe to sort of protect the purity of the book itself and sort of the religious context of it. Here is an example of a medieval cover of a book of hours, just to show you how elaborate these were. This used to be one of the ones I taught during the Gothic section. But as you can see, these covers are extraordinary. They're gold, silver, and precious jewels. So I just wanted you to see that. So when we're looking at this composition, one of the things I hope that you remember from the early Italian Renaissance is this idea of illusionistic space. Remember, they were experimenting with linear one-point perspective and making the space look very much illusionistic and real. Here, I think if you look at it, it looks slightly funny. It almost seems as if the perspective is slightly tilted upward. Again, this was really not because they didn't understand linear perspective, but it was really a way for them to maximize the view. So Northern Renaissance painters weren't concerned with linear perspective like the Italians, so that's something that you should remember in terms of differences between the two styles. Another characteristic of North Renaissance painting is something called disguised symbolism. And these were basically just sort of objects that had, this sort of disguised meaning or symbols that were sort of put or, used throughout the composition. So here we have a vase of lilies on the table. We see an extinguished candle. And these are all referencing certain aspects of Mary and other figures like Jesus Christ. The lilies are representing her purity, the fact that she's a virgin. The extinguished candle is supposed to symbolize Christ's true light has entered the room. And this idea is, because it's been extinguished, that this is reflecting this idea of the moment of this conception, or immaculate conception that has happened. So there is a tremendous amount of symbols that are embedded in this work. And there's also lots of specific details and lots of surface texture. So if you really look close, I really think you get to see a sense of how detailed and precise. Look at her hair. Look at the cloth and, even the decoration on the vase. So this is very indicative of North Renaissance painting. And also the disguised symbolism. And there's so much disguised symbolism in here. We'll talk about a few of the objects, but we're not going to talk about everything, obviously. So when I was talking earlier about the extinguished candle, if we look further up the composition, this is kind of cute over here. We see the light of Christ is symbolized by this sort of teeny, look at it, a little teeny heroic Christ coming through the lead glass window without breaking it, which is another sort of sign of this immaculate conception. And also not breaking the glass would also symbolize that Mary's virginity is also intact. So there's really specific sort of meanings, and there are probably a lot that, art historians haven't figured out yet. So we're going to move over to the right side of the panel, and we're going to take a closer look at that. On the right panel is a depiction of Joseph, Mary's husband. He's depicted as a carpenter working in his shop. He was chosen to be Mary's husband and to look out for her. They did not live together and were not intimate with each other as you think of when you think of a man and wife. He was more of her protector figure and more really of sort of a stepfather figure. Again, note the very descriptive details. He's drilling. He is drilling, and he also has various tools on his workbench. And again, sort of note the detail and sort of the surface description of how they're depicted. So again, this really incredible surface detail and textures are recorded. We really get the sense of coarseness of the hair on his beard. Artists used very tiny brushes to depict such incredible detail. We would never, ever see this kind of detail in early Renaissance painting. Note, we're going to look at another detail of the composition. Note the mousetrap on the window ledge. Again, this is another form of disguised symbolism. Joseph is making these, and this is another, an example of, I'm sorry about that. I got a little mixed up in my notes. So again, Joseph is making these mousetraps, which we see on the ledge. And again, this is another example of disguised symbolism. Joseph is like a mousetrap, posing as Mary's husband. That's how some art historians have interpreted this. A renowned art historian, Shapiro, you don't have to remember his name, proposed that the mousetrap, Joseph, was meant to fool or trap Satan. And Shapiro actually built one of the mousetraps depicted in the painting, and he actually was able to catch 5 mice. The mousetrap could also be a symbol for Jesus to trap and snare the devil. When we look closer at the composition, we see the city in the background depicted with great detail. Also, this signals that Joseph is upstairs in his shop and not on the same ground level as Mary. Note how the light and shade recorded on the lattice work over here. Again, really incredible surface detail being recorded. I mean, look at this. When we move to the left side of the panel of this triptych altarpiece, we see that the donors are depicted over here. And they're sort of being given a privileged viewpoint to see the visitation unfold. Notice the key in the lock over here. And again, this really incredible use of surface detail, and obviously we'll look at some disguise symbolism as well. So one of the first examples we notice is this rose bush without thorns. Again, this was supposed to symbolize the Virgin Mary. We see some birds perched on the wall, which is supposed to represent the Passion of Christ. And this is interesting here. This is supposed to be perhaps a detail or a self-portrait of Robert Campin, the artist himself. That's what some artists have said. Violets on the ground also is a form of disguise symbolism, and this was supposed to represent humility. These flowers grow on the ground, and so because of that, not many flowers sort of grow that way, directly on the ground. They're more of like in a bush or something like that. But here, and they're so small that it's easily for violets to get trampled by the feet. So again, that's sort of alluding to the humility part. Violet is also purple, which is a royal color, and obviously is well suited in terms of depicting or representing the Virgin Mary. Our next work of art that we're going to be looking at is by Jan van Eyck, or Jan van Eyck, however you want to pronounce it, Man in a Red Turban. This isn't on your official AP College Board list of works, but it's an important one for you to know. We'll be looking at the technique of oil painting with this portrait that you see here. So northern painters used oil paints compared to Italian painters who used fresco and tempera. This technique allowed artists to do more detail. It was a layering technique that incorporated many glazes, varnishes, and linseed oil. So the artist had to wait for each layer to dry before starting another one. So oil paint takes a long time to dry. That's one of the drawbacks of it. So this allowed artists to work more slowly and to go back and rework areas if needed. Van Eyck was considered the master of oil painting and really brought the painting medium to new heights. So when we look at this portrait, we really do see how this building up of layers gives us really incredible sense of tonal range within the skin that you couldn't achieve with tempera or fresco painting. The effect is much richer because it dries slower and allows the artist to work the paint in different ways. It also allows for incredible surface detail that can be achieved. Notice the stubble on the jawline of the sitter, and also sort of the realistic look of the sagging skin, indicating that this is not a young man, but more of a middle-aged man. But his skin still has a very translucent, transparent quality to it that is only achieved by using this oil medium. Surface and texture details of the fur, and it's hard to see in here against the fur coat against the dark background, is also one of those sort of ways of this sort of descriptive detail that we often attribute to North Renaissance painting. In this part of the composition, we're going to focus on the eyes, but notice how this glazing technique allows the artist to pick a sort of wetness about the eyes. We can even see the red veins, so it really looks quite realistic from that point of view. The turban depicted is fabulous and wonderfully rendered. We can see this sort of modeling and drapery. Obviously, 15th century North Europeans did not wear turbans, so this was a way for him to show off his wonderful skill and technique in oil painting. And so this turban that he's wearing, and some people do think that this is a self-portrait of Van Eyck that he would use to show his clients, to show what he could do. And so the red turban, by wearing it, was just a way for him to kind of show off his painting skills and show how he could achieve this sort of three-dimensional modeling effect with oil painting. At the bottom of the frame, we see that Van Eyck has signed the portrait, and he's also inscribed with it a quote. And so what it translates to is, "The best I am capable of doing, as I cannot, as I would." He also includes the date, which was unusual for this time. So we're starting to see, again, this idea of the individuality of the artist. They're not these anonymous artisans or laborers that we encountered in the medieval period and earlier. Artists are getting notoriety, and they're also understanding their place within the world. And so by dating this work, he's aware of time, and he's also aware of his time and his place in it, which is an interesting thing to think about in terms of the personality of this idea of the artist or the individual artist, or the sort of talented great artist. And so he knows that his work will be remembered. So he's obviously very confident in his skill. And so this concept goes back to the identity of the artist and his self-awareness of his talent. And this is why I'm showing this piece, and I think it's a really important piece. Even though it's not officially on your list, it's one that you might encounter, and it's also one that you might be able to use in one of the free response essays, and a good one to use. As I mentioned earlier, this would have been a portfolio piece to show patrons as an example of what he could do and his skills to get commissions. This is also a new concept in relation to the work process of the artist, that he has a portfolio. And so this is where we're really starting to see this idea of what a modern painter is, which is probably more familiar to you. I'm going to stop here. In part 2, we'll be looking at some more North Renaissance painting, early Renaissance painting, as well as some later 16th century painting as well. So I hope you look forward to it. I want to reiterate that all the works that you have seen are on the list. I know I forgot to put the stars, and I will put the stars on when I upload your PowerPoint. So don't freak out. The only one that isn't official is this portrait done by Van Eyck. The next picture that we're going to talk about in segment 2 is on the list of your official College Board, AP College Board list.